Hello, my name is Reggie Chapman. I use he, him pronouns. I am the Director of Policy at the Fortune Society David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, which is a discussion-driven show that examines the criminal legal system from various perspectives, including those most impacted by the system. Here we discuss critical questions about how the criminal legal system works, its intersections with social justice, and the efforts that advocates are making to improve the lives of everyone impacted. We ask that you, the viewers, spread the word about Both Sides of the Bars and share your comments with us on Twitter, also known as X, at the Fortune SOC. Today's show is titled Beyond Recidivism: Why Desistance is the Preferred Measure of Success. Today's show will examine how policymakers often rely on recidivism to measure public safety alone, despite its limits. We will discuss how adding desistance to the analysis provides a further picture of reentry by capturing progress, setbacks, and the role of support systems like housing, work, and education. This shifting perspective can guide policies that both improve public safety and expand opportunities for lasting change. This episode features two desistance scholars, Dr. Ronald F. Day and Dr. Shab Maruna. Dr. Day is the Chief Operating Officer at the Fortune Society, where he oversees many of his programmatic areas. He is also a preeminent desistance scholar who has hosted several webinars and workshops on the topic. Dr. Maruna is the head of the Department of Sociology, Social Policy, and Criminology at the University of Liverpool. He is also an internationally recognized criminologist and leading desistance scholar. Good afternoon, Dr. Day and Dr. Maruna.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chapman, Reggie.
And so, we're definitely excited to have you guys here to discuss this very, very important topic. And so I guess with no further, we can kind of just dive into the questions to kind of send our audience and allow them to understand the topic which we're discussing. So I guess my first question is for you, Dr. Day. From your perspective, how should we define recidivism and desistance in the context of successful reentry?
First of all, thank you, Reggie, for the question. I want to clarify one thing. I'm not preeminent in anything, so I'm just trying to do the work and just be the best that I possibly can be. And so thank you for the question and talking about defining recidivism and desistance in the context of successful reentry. So recidivism, we often look at recidivism as rearrest, as reincarcerations, and as reconvictions. Now, I think that the way our system is ultimately set up, we try to use recidivism to measure success, but it's a measure of failure because it's looking at those failures of the system. On the other hand, when you look at desistance, first of all, a lot of people, including practitioners, are not familiar with the term desistance. Like I've been to many places, forums, conferences, etc., and I say, well, how many of you have heard of desistance as a metric? In very few people, including those who've been doing work in the criminal legal system, criminal justice field for a long time, they haven't heard of desistance. So I just wanted to add that particular context. But desistance is basically to desist. So what are the different factors and influences that encourage someone to desist from crime? And what we look at, and I think in layman's terms, you look at desistance as someone who's been impacted by the system, right? Likely who might have served some time in jails or in prisons and has been involved in crime. And now moving toward desistance, that means that the person is either not likely committing crimes, for example, as often as they did before. I used to be someone who was involved in drug dealing, and drug dealing meant that I was committing crimes almost every day, Reggie, almost every day. And so that meant that in order to desist, like I have to set myself up for a situation where I'm not engaging in crime as often as I was if I'm moving towards desistance. The other thing is the seriousness of crimes. If I'm out there and I'm committing like a major robbery, I'm going to committing a bank robbery, and then I'm moving towards desistance, then I could still be engaging in some criminal behavior. For example, I could set up a situation where I'm doing car washes for people. That's against the law because I don't actually have a license to do it. But you know what? I'm not sticking up a bank. I'm not robbing anybody. I'm actually I feel like I'm doing a service for the community, but I don't have a license. So I'm actually committing a crime, but it's not a crime necessarily that's harming someone. So And then there's ultimate desistance, where the person who has been involved in the system is no longer involved in crime at all, is not involved in any types of crimes, and not just something that we know is defined as crime, but the person is just not involved in crime. Because sometimes we think about recidivism and we're like, well, this person is not involved in crime, but that doesn't mean that the person is doing well. So that's the latter part of your question about successful reentry. When people are released from incarceration, as I was after serving 15 years in prison, like I say, I've achieved a modicum of success, because in 18 years, I just made 18 years, I've been able to acquire some education. I'm an executive at a preeminent organization. And we have a lot of other people who've been able to achieve some success in their transition from prison to the community. And you have other people who might have desisted from crime, but let's say they're on parole and they have a technical parole violation. This means, Reggie, that they didn't commit a crime, but they could be back in the system for a violation of a technical issue. And so now you end up potentially disrupting the desistance process of someone. And so you end up impacting their successful reentry. And the opposite is that, oh, someone hasn't recidivated, they haven't gone back from a successful reentry standpoint, but they're unhoused. They find it extremely difficult to get a job and they're really struggling. They could be using substances. You have a person using substances, unhoused, unemployed. That person might not be committing crimes, but we certainly, they probably wouldn't either, identify themselves as having successfully reentered.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Day. I think you said so many profound things, some of which are that, like, when you talk about recidivism, you mentioned that it measures failure, right? And I think that's something that we should think about. You also mentioned that, like, just because a person hasn't recidivated doesn't mean that they're doing well. Are they housed? Or do they have health care, right? Do they have employment? And so I think that what you explain here captures the reason why we need to think about desistance as a matter of success, or at least in conjunction with recidivism as a measure of success. Because when we're really thinking about, like, recidivism, I think the operative term is like successful reentry, and what successful reentry actually means in society. So I just thank you for speaking about that. And I just think that's something that policymakers, that, society, and all invested people should be thinking about when we're thinking about these terms. Thank you, Dr. Day. So with that being said, I think I'll move to my question for Shad. Dr. Maruna, desistance often describes a gradual process that includes setbacks. From your research, what have you learned about how people change over time, even if you don't meet the narrow definition of success that recidivism suggests?
So I guess one of the things that's come out of our work is we look at kind of stages of desistance, and Ronald's already talked about, desistance isn't a moment, a lightning bolt hits you and everything changes, where you're going from one state immediately to another. It's a gradual process, and we have found it useful to in defining this concept, to borrow from the literature on offending, which has talked about primary and secondary offending, and by that they mean primary offending is just doing the act. You tried drugs, for example. A lot of people do that. Just about everybody in their youth will sample drugs, but there's a difference between that and then becoming a drug user, taking on that identity, making it your entire life, maybe going through addiction. But it's a subtle difference, but it's a dramatic one. And researchers in the criminology found that actually a lot of our research in trying to predict who would dabble in primary deviance, we couldn't find out, none of our models predicted well because it was so widespread. But what became a more productive focus was looking at secondary deviants, those who become identified with criminal acts. So going from somebody who vandalized a shop to somebody who is a graffiti artist, somebody who does this regularly, and it's a part of their identity, or drug sales, as we talked about. And desistance, helpfully, it can be looked at in the same way. I mean, if desistance is just the absence of recidivism, well, that could mean a lot of things. You could be in hospital, you could be on the streets, you could be locked up. A lot of reasons why you might have, and everyone does have breaks in offending, even the person who's dealing drugs, and as you say, it's like a job, you need to go to it, but there are gaps and behavior there. And it's difficult to read those gaps in behavior, and again, if all we're interested in is a lack of recidivism, well, you could interpret that in lots of ways. You could say, well, that person was deterred from crime, so maybe the system worked because it was so hard. Or you could say, well, that person was rehabilitated because the system was so soft. They gave them tools. We have no idea. It's just an absence of behavior. So if we think of desistance more as an identity change, as taking on this new sense of purpose, as you say, a success focus, or strength focus, to say, what do we want people to become? Do we when we talk about desistance, it's not just stopping offending; it's becoming productive citizens. It's becoming part of the community, reintegrating into communities, and so forth. And that gives us that kind of positive goals to aspire to, but it also gives us some theory there. We can when you say I want to promote desistance, well, there's a body of research where we know what correlates to desistance. Things like good jobs where the person feels valued, good stable relationships with their family, with romantic partners. uh, um, Integration into education and volunteer work and other opportunities. So desistance has this body of theory and research behind it, whereas recidivism reduction, I mean, everybody's got their favorite way of reducing recidivism, and it can range anything from bringing the military out on the streets to art therapy, but desistance is a tighter, more scientific concept.
Thank you, Doc. I appreciate that perspective too, because I think you said a lot of things in there, but there are two things I want to harp on, which is that when you talk about like with recidivism measures, if we don't have recidivism, there's just an absence of contact with the criminal legal system. And when we talk about desistance, correct me if I'm wrong, when you talk about like being able to be a productive citizen, and not only you're not like having encounters with the criminal legal system and or possibly committing crime, but you're actually doing something in which you can actually be productive and contribute to society. And I think that is something that's missing from the conversation. And that is something we need to talk about more in respect to recidivism, because it's not just about like incarceration and mass incarceration. It's not just an isolation. This affects the entire system. And so if we want to address these issues the right way, we need to address society as a whole. So I really appreciate that perspective. And I hope that more people will pay attention to that messaging. Thank you, Doc. So I want to go back to Dr. Day. Dr. Day, policymakers often assume that lower recidivism automatically means that communities are safer. How would you challenge this assumption?
That's a great question. First off, I would argue that there is a lot of information regarding crime that is not even captured. And there's also states, localities don't always measure recidivism the same. So there's a lot of like nuance in how recidivism is measured. So if you're saying that you automatically think that your community is safer just because you have lower recidivism, I think that leaves out a great deal of information. Just like I wouldn't say, right, on the inverse, that if people desist from crime, that communities are necessarily safer. right? Generally speaking, we would think so. But let's say that you have some individuals who are no longer desisting from crime, but they are like abusive in other ways, like in the household. Like I'm not committing a crime, but I'm very abusive towards my wife and towards my child. Like that doesn't make the community safer. So we just have to go outside of thinking that we have the answer to all of the questions and the nuance just by saying that recidivism rates are lower in a particular community. There was a report that I was involved in. Shad was one of the folks who was involved in as well, called "The Limits of Recidivism: Measuring Success After Prison." It was a report that was put out by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and we took a lot of like we had a lot of conversations with experts, and we had this distinguished panel of individuals, and we just learned that again, there's so many issues with the measuring of desistance that you want to make sure you're careful in how much you're relying on it in determining that your community is safer. We talked about, for example, alternative like metrics, alternative measures of success, because again, if you look at recidivism as a measure of failure, so you're saying that your community is safer because you're measuring failure. Now, I think you made a point a second ago, and it's that what we should be doing to a large extent is looking at how people who transition from prison, as one example, not just how they either don't recidivate or how they are desisting, but what, like, how are they thriving in like their transition from prison to the community? How well are they actually doing? And that's why one of the metrics that we use in the study is actually well-being. We were looking at, it's really hard to measure success. You're like, oh, like there are all of these ways to measure success. You ask 10 people, they might have different measures of success. But if you ask people about well-being, and there are some like scales, some ways to measure well-being, you might get like general answer. Like if a person is using drugs, other people wouldn't likely think, unless they're like for like a medicinal purpose or something, that person is doing well necessarily. If a person is unemployed for an extensive period of time, we wouldn't necessarily think this person is doing well, unless they're like independently wealthy or something like that. Because generally speaking, people come home from incarceration need jobs. They need gainful employment, as Shad said, where not just where they're earning a decent wage, but where they're developing relationship. Desistance tells us that it's about developing relationships with the individuals who you work with. So I would just say I wouldn't rely heavily on saying that my community is safer just because I have lower recidivism. Because when I go out and I see people unhoused, that doesn't tell me that just because you're not committing a crime, that our community is safer necessarily. Because one thing could lead to another. Once a person is unhoused, there could be something that the person decides to do to find housing. If a person is on substances, there could be something that the person decides to do, right? That could be leading them back into crime, leading them back into something that's more harmful for the community.
Thank you, Dr. Day. I appreciate the perspective. And I got so excited when you begin to talk about this idea of what's safe and what's not, and just because the person hasn't recidivated. And it reminds me of a conversation I've had with my colleagues over time when we talk about like well-being and being good people. Just because a person hasn't committed a crime, that something, because crime is legislated. And so just because a person hasn't committed offense and or been in contact with the criminal legal system does not mean that they're doing things that make the world safe. And as you mentioned, being abusive to your children, to your spouse, to your neighbors, like that in itself is danger. When you yell at people and you're mean to them, you create, that in itself is violent in nature, and it has cascading effects, which kind of like lends itself to what you just said in your last piece, which you spoke of, talking about like if a person is not housed, and that sets a situation in which over time they may be more inclined to engage in destructive behavior and social behavior. So I really appreciate that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that is just something that I think that we need to continue to echo to the masses so that they understand how powerful and how effective desistance is as a metric, and why we should incorporate it into this process. And I appreciate that, Doc. So I want to shift back to Dr. Morona. Again, policymakers often view reentry through a lens of crime reduction. How can shifting the focus to desistance help us think more realistically about long-term public safety?
Yeah, well, I mean, so Ronald's already talked about the problems of recidivism being a state measure, and that although that on the one hand says, well, good, well, the power is in really the state's hands. If they want to reduce recidivism, all they have to do is stop enforcing and looking for crimes and enforcing the law. That seems a really bad idea. In fact, the opposite is true. We know that people coming out of the criminal justice system, whether they be on probation or parole or coming out of jail, are the most watched population by far. There's a huge number, what we call the dark figure of crime, and for different crimes, it can be 99 crimes out of 100 that go undetected. So it's and other crimes, it's less than that, more serious crimes. But even with homicide, huge numbers go undetected of these crimes. It's much less likely if you're on a tag or you're under a probation orders that your behaviors are going to go undetected. In fact, things we already mentioned, technical violations and things which aren't even crimes, can get you sent back to prison if you're on paroles. So in many ways, justice theorists have suggest we sometimes think of, well, the recidivist is worse than the first time offender because the recidivist had their chance, and they were given a second chance, and here they are recidivating. In truth, most penal theorists now think actually the recidivist has just they were obviously in a bad place when they went into the criminal justice system, and all the justice system has done is made their lives worse. They've if we think about the things that keep people out of trouble, having a job, having a place to live, having strong family ties, the justice system systematically decimates all of those things. You come out of a prison with very little capital of any sort, social, financial, or otherwise, and then we expect people to turn their lives around. Well, it's no surprise that many will go back to the devil they know. So recidivism is problematic in lots of ways. The other part of your question I wanted to get to, though, why is desistance better? One other simple factor is, even if you thought of desistance as the opposite of recidivism, at least it's focusing on a positive. When your focus is on the negative or the double negative of avoiding recidivism, it lends itself to a risk focus, and that is, okay, what are this person's risk factors? What are they doing that looks a little bit risky? And everything the system does is looking to catch the person out from doing that bad thing. So let's get the urine test. Let's check through their phones. So it's all this kind of cops and robbers game of trying to find out the person's secrets. But if you're looking for desistance, it turns your focus from looking for the bad to looking for the good. And then, okay, wait, this guy, he's volunteering at this organization. He's coaching for his kids' basketball team. He's doing these positive things. This looks like you might be reintegrating. You might be trying to desist. We call these desistance signals, and we look for the signals that a person's trying to desist. Now, it doesn't say that we ignore reoffending, but we don't panic if there's a relapse. We recognize that relapse is part of this process. And we say, we're not just going to look for the relapse. We're also going to say, let's put that in the context of he was trying. He's gone back to school. He's committing himself to a relationship. He's got all these other desistance factors going on. We can put that relapse into that context. Yes, it's unfortunate that he had a bad night and he used again, but we're not going to undermine all this good stuff just because of the one bad. So it's that kind of looking for the good, and then you find it that is really important in Desistance.
Thank you, Doc. I appreciate that perspective. And I want to just see if I can couch some of that. We're kind of getting closer against time, but I want to kind of capture some of the things I think you said that were most salient, which are that, when you talk about like desistance, we're not like juxtaposing desistance and recidivism. What you're saying is that they need to be used in tandem, and because you articulated about not ignoring the other things, not ignoring that they may have, relapse or these other things going in life. But what we're really trying to do is bring these two metrics together and in a wholesome way produce something that's advantageous for not just the individuals who's trying to improve their standings in life and the community overall. I just want to say that so that our viewers know that, when we talk about desistance and recidivism, we're talking about these two metrics working in tandem. I appreciate your perspectives, gentlemen. It was a thought-provoking discussion. I'm better learned by having it with you guys. I really appreciate it. Before we go, you guys have any final words? You have maybe like 30 seconds apiece to give me some final words.
So I'll just say, first of all, thank you for the conversation. To me, this is something that's really critical because we do need to understand the limits of recidivism. We just did a webinar with Council for State Governments where we talked about beyond recidivism. I think everyone understands now that can't be the sole metric that we're using because it's a measure of failure. We're not just talking about desistance. We're talking about using those in tandem along with all of these other alternative metrics that help us get a much more comprehensive understanding of what's happening in the criminal legal system. And I'll leave it there.
So thank you, Doc. And so thank you for that perspective. And before we end the show, I want to say thank you to our guests, Dr. Day and Dr. Maruna, for sharing your thoughts. Thank you to our viewers for joining us for a thought-provoking conversation. On behalf of the Fortune Society, we thank you so much for tuning in to Both Sides of the Bars. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org. That is fortunesociety.org, or on Facebook by typing in the Fortune Society. This is Reggie Chapman, and I appreciate you for joining us on Critically Looking at Both Sides of the Bars. Thank you.